1943 and was not completely dropped until the 1960s. When they weren't racist. How about when they were just threatening? You remember when I showed you this a few weeks ago? This is SEIU. SEIU protesters on the lawn of a Bank of America employee. He was not there, but his teenage son was home and terrified. Let me take you back again to San Francisco and 1877. This guy. Okay, remember this? 1877. This is the same scene, except it's in picture form because they didn't have a video camera. Labor leader Dennis Kearney and his cronies, they went to the wealthy neighborhoods in San Francisco and told at least one meeting, quote, "A little judicious hanging right now, here and now, would be the best course to pursue with the capitalists and the stock sharps who are all threatening time to rob us." Yet in another meeting, he warned the railroad owners to fire all Chinese laborers. Remember Judge Lynch. That's the labor union. It's the same thing. History repeats itself unless you understand history and you stop it.
The labor union leadership today would like us to believe that it's really something to help the little guy, but haven't they used strong-arm tactics and even racism to determine who gets in the unions and who gets jobs?
The racist roots run deep in the union movement. In the black leadership from the time of the Civil War and after to World War II, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are the two most prominent leaders. They didn't agree on much, right, but one thing they did agree on was unions were bad for black Americans. They discriminated against blacks, they wouldn't let them in unions, and they harmed them and killed them sometimes when they served as strikebreakers.
Again, something we never learned in the public schools.
Rarely. And unions, I mean, you look at this question, are unions good for America? Is there any unionized industry that has flourished? I mean, look at the auto workers, the steel workers, the rubber workers in the tire industry. Are any of those industries better off in helping America more because of what the unions have done in those industries?
The answers are obvious. Ahead, she was the mother of birth control. You learned that in school. But what you aren't taught is that she wanted to use birth control to wipe out an entire race. What you've never been taught about Margaret Sanger, next. She's admired by progressives and even by our present Secretary of State. But Glenn doesn't share the same feelings about Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger. Take a look at this clip that Burton's actually in, and we'll comment on it some more after you watch.
Let's go on Margaret Sanger, because in the history books, this is what they say about Margaret Sanger. Boy, she was a princess. She started the first birth control clinic in 1916. We're taught that she's a champion of women's reproductive rights. She coined the phrase birth control, founder of Planned Parenthood. But in infancy, the movement Sanger led was part of a radical vision for reforming the world that made common cause with the socialist and the IWW in challenging the limits of progressive reform. I don't think that goes far enough. She was, correct me if I'm wrong, trying to wipe out the, quote, Negro race. Was she not?
Yes. She starts something called the Negro Project, in which she tries to enlist black ministers and get them to go into their neighborhoods and tell black people not to reproduce because they are, in her words, an unfit group.
Does she not? So she has these horrible ideas about Negroes, and she says, and I'm using her word, Negroes, she goes on to say, we don't want the Negro to know that we're trying to wipe them out. God forbid they catch on. But then why does she leave the country? She leaves the country. Is she not kicked out to go over to Europe, or she goes over and she learns a more subtle way, does she not?
Yes. Right.
She goes over to Europe and she learns a more subtle way, eugenics, which is very popular, and talk just about birth control. When she first starts about talking about birth control, it's because she recognizes that her overt racism can't be sold. Correct?
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
We're leaving out one really important point here.
What is that?
She gives a speech to a Klan rally in 1926.
What does she say?
Well, there is no record of what she said, but one person said it was something like, we need to get rid of these unfit people.
She was also part of this eugenics movement, which was to breed a better person, breed a better voter.
It was.
Right?
Yeah.
Which led directly, it was the American progressive eugenics movement that migrated over to Europe.
Not all progressives were involved, but many were. Henry
Okay.
Fairfield Osborn, Madison Grant were involved in the eugenics.
And California was involved in it, big time, were they not? And they migrated the eugenics over to Europe, which there's the idea of the Aryan race and the fit society, and we'll breed the ultimate race, and led to the gas chambers.
And where does all this start and kind of catch on in Europe? Public health. They are always claiming this is in the name of public health. We have to make sure that unfit groups don't reproduce because they're damaging public health. So it's all done in the name of health care.
Margaret Sanger, idolized in the public school system as telling people how to live their lives without having babies. In reality, a vicious racist.
What we see in those clips and in your question here, Margaret Sanger is the founder of Planned Parenthood.
Right.
They have birth control.
Right.
And what it's being used for is to diminish the number of black Americans. She wants to reduce their numbers. She's a racist, she's a eugenicist, and that is the purpose of her movement with Planned Parenthood. It's tragic.
We know from the clips we just saw that she affiliated with the KKK. We know she talked about aborting black babies. But we don't know this from the public schools.
We don't. You're hard-pressed to find a textbook. In that clip, you have Larry Schweikart. His book, Patriots' History of the United States, is great.
Right.
Try to find another book that gives you the true story about Margaret Sanger. There aren't many.
Back in a moment. So here's some of what we learned in tonight's crash course. For one, you're not imagining things. History is, in fact, being distorted and even erased. We learned that Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt did more to destroy the Constitution than practically all other U.S. presidents combined.
Why is it we were never taught that he prolonged the Depression? That FDR waged a war against the Constitution? What about Woodrow Wilson? I hate this guy. I don't even want to show his picture. Why is it that no textbook teaches that Wilson was imprisoning Americans who spoke out against his war, World War I? Or that Wilson's high tax policies led to a depression in 1920, ignored in all of the history books? Why is that?
Roosevelt openly mocked the Constitution by calling it a horse and buggy document. We learned that President Obama and FDR share a lot in common, like choosing to revive the economy with massive government spending and creating or expanding government entitlement programs.
In the midst of the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt signed Social Security into law, laying a cornerstone in the foundation of America's middle class. We have an obligation to keep that promise.
Those are things they have to pay for over and over and over again. We learned that with the separation of church and state, our founders did want to keep the state out of the church, but not the church out of the state.
Separation church and state, let me go at it another way. Number one, the phrase doesn't exist in any constitutional document, any government document. So we're now talking about a metaphor that has no place in the Constitution except because judges tell us it belongs there.
Certainly not out of the public square. We learned that unions weren't always for equal rights for all.
California Working Man's Party was born in racism because they found their success in the slogan, "The Chinese must go."
We learned that birth control for Margaret Sanger was partly an idea to get African Americans not to reproduce so they wouldn't keep having babies.
She gives a speech to a Klan rally in 1926.
What does she say?
Well, there is no record of what she said, but one person said it was something like, we need to get rid of these unfit people.
Find out where we're headed tomorrow. Next. Thanks for joining us tonight. And a special thanks to Professor Burton Folsom Jr. for joining us. Make sure you buy his book, New Deal or Raw Deal. And if you want, you can catch me on the Fox Business Network, 10 a.m. Eastern on Saturday with Freedom Watch. Tomorrow night on this program, Controlling the Message. From New York, defending freedom. Good night, America.